to Sheeran Guitar Tutorials. My name's David, and in today's lesson, I'll be going over how Ed Sheeran plays Little Bird in his live performances. Now, even though I'll be going over the live version today, I'll be making comments as I go if you'd like an easier way to play the song. So whether you're a beginner or a veteran, there's something in this tutorial for you. You'll need your guitar in standard tuning and a capo on the 6th fret. So be sure to like this video, comment what you think, subscribe to the channel, and turn on all those notifications. Let's jump on in. So starting now with the chords, there are essentially only 4 or 5, but if you've ever watched closely how Ed Sheeran plays his songs live, you'll notice he loves to make small changes to the chords throughout the song. Basically an extra note here, one less note there, that kind of thing. So because of that, we have about 14 or so chords to learn if you want to play the live version. So all the chords I'm about to show you are used in the live version of Little Bird, but if you just want to use the basic version of each chord to make the song a little bit easier, that's fine. First up is a B minor 7 chord, which is shown on the screen now and would kind of sound like this. Now, if you just want to play a normal B minor chord for that, that's totally fine, and you could play a normal B minor chord whenever you see a B minor variant throughout the song. That's up to you. Next is technically a B11 chord, but we're just going to call it a B minor 7 prime, and that's shown up on the screen now. Now this chord, and any other chord I show you that has a prime, is essentially just a lead-in to hammer on for the full B minor 7 that we just went over. But I wanted to show it as its own chord because that's probably a little bit easier to understand. Though if you don't want to use this chord throughout the song, that's totally up to you. But just to show you, a B minor 7 prime would kind of sound like this. But again, it's just a lead-in to a B minor 7. Next is a G sus2 chord, which is fretted and should sound like this. Now this could be the only G chord you use for the whole song, or you could play a normal G chord. That's totally up to you. Next is actually a G5, but we'll call it a G sus2 prime, and it's played as shown. Now, similar to the B minor 7 prime, this is more or less a lead-in to hammer on to the G sus2. So use it if you want, although there is a part in the pre-choruses where you do actually use a G5 chord. Next is what I think is actually a D sus2 sus4 chord, but we're just going to call it a G sus2 star because that makes it a little easier. And so it's shown up on the screen right now, and it should sound like this. But again, don't use this one if you want an easier way to play the song. A normal G chord is just fine, or any of the other G variants that I'm going over. Next is a G sus2 star prime, which is played like this. And again, this is just a lead-in chord to the G sus2 star. Next is a D sus4, which you can play like this. Now this could be the only D chord you play for the whole song, or you could play a normal D chord, like that, which is also used in Ed's live performances, so you will need to know the normal D chord. But if you just want to use the normal D chord, do that, it's totally up to you. Next is actually a D sus2, which is played like this. A D sus2 prime. An A sus4. A normal A chord, which would sound like this. And so how Ed usually plays this is using his index finger to bar the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th strings. And what he'll do is he'll use both the A and the A sus4 chords for his live performances. But feel free to choose either if you just want to stick to an easier version of the song. Then finally, there's a bit of a funky chord that gets used a little bit in the pre-choruses, and it's a C sharp diminished 7th. And that would kind of sound like this. Next, we'll get into strumming. Now, this is a classic Ed Sheeran song, where every time he goes through a part of the song, the strumming is ever so slightly different. So that technically means, if you really wanted to play it exactly how he does, there's 20 or so strumming patterns to learn. But what I'll do now is show you kind of the core patterns that you would need, whether you want to play the song live or an easier version. And these patterns should give you a good place to start, and then it's up to you from there where you want to go with your strumming. After we go over these core patterns, I'll get into all the others as we go through the song for those that are interested. So shown up on the screen now is 8 different strumming patterns that kind of make up the core of the song, whether you're playing the live or the studio version. Some points to note that will carry throughout the song are as followed. Strums that are underlined mean you're palm muting when you're strumming, and so palm muting is done by kind of laying the fleshy bit of your strumming hand on the bridge of your guitar while you're strumming, just like that. And then strums that are bolded, you should try and emphasize those a little bit more just to give the song a little bit more rhythm. So instead of just like a down-up strum, it would, with a bolded down strum, it would kind of sound like this. Instead of this. And finally, there's one pattern with some X's on it, and that just kind of means you're tapping the body of your guitar with your fingers. So it could sound like this. So just going through these patterns really quickly, number 1 is probably the most common, and you could use that for the entirety of the song if you would like. So if you want to play the song a little bit easier with the strumming, pattern 1 is really all you need to learn. And just an example, to use that pattern on a B minor 7, it would sound something like this. So it's really, you're just playing a chord for that first down strum, and then you're muting the rest. And honestly, you could add an extra up strum between the first 2 down strums if that's easier for you to keep the rhythm. So that's totally up to you. So if you want a super easy way to strum this whole song, this is the only pattern you need. Pattern 2 is pretty similar, but it's used typically near the end of a chord progression throughout the verses and the choruses. So just to give you an example, it would sound something like this. Pattern 3 is typically in the pre-choruses, and I would still recommend learning even if you want to play an easier version of the song. This one isn't too bad. So to just play this strumming pattern on a G sus2 chord, it would kind of sound like this. Pattern 4 is actually almost just the reverse of pattern 3. And again, it's not too bad, so I'd recommend learning. Just to give you an idea on how it would sound for something like an A sus4, it would kind of sound like this. Pattern 5 would sound something like this. Pattern 6 kind of combines patterns 1 and 5 and would sound something like this. Pattern 7 is used in the bridge of the song and sounds something like this. And then finally, pattern 8 is used at the very end, and again would sound something like this. So again, those are the main 8 strumming patterns I'd recommend learning, regardless if you want to play the song live or an easier version. Totally up to you which ones you want to use. So just so you have them all in one spot, these are all the patterns you'll need for the whole song showing up on the screen now. So if you got the first 8 down and would like to practice the rest, pause this video here and take your time learning everything. I will say it's easier to learn most of these when you have chords to play along with them. So let's jump on into the song. So let's start with the intro. It's just a 4-chord chord progression, and I have the chords and strumming highlighted in different colors to show you which chords get played with which part of the strumming patterns. So starting now with the B minor 7 block. If you're playing this song how Ed does live, you'd start with a down strum for the B minor 7 prime, and then you'd fret the rest of the B minor 7 with an up strum. If you were playing an easy version of the song, you'd leave out the B minor 7 prime and just maybe play a normal B minor chord. From there, you're doing about 6.5 down-up pairs of muted strumming with some alternating emphasis on some down strums. And so that part would just sound like this. You'll also notice this is one of the variations of the first strumming pattern we just went over. It's basically the same, you just have an extra up strum at the beginning. So the entirety of the B minor 7 block would sound like this. From there, you move on to the G sus2 star block. And similar to the strumming for the B minor 7 block, it's just an alternate of the first strumming pattern we went over before. And so it's pretty similar to the previous block, but the G sus2 star prime gets an up down before moving on to the full G sus2 star chord. So for G sus2 star prime, it's up down before moving on to the full G sus2 star chord. So just that full beginning bit would kind of sound like this. And again, an easier version of the song, you could just start with a normal G sus2 star. Totally up to you. And so then you just have the same muted strumming portion like you did for the B minor 7 block. So the entirety of the G sus2 block would sound something like this. The D sus2 block is fretted and strummed the same way as the G sus2 star, but now it's just the D sus2. So the entire thing of this block would sound like this. And then finally you have the D sus2 A sus4 block. And it's the same strumming pattern as the previous two blocks, but you're changing to the A sus4 about halfway through, and you're not muting anymore. So the whole thing slowly would sound something like this. And a little bit faster, it would sound like this. And so the entirety of the intro would sound like this. Moving on now to the first half of verse 1, you have a B minor 7 block using a strumming pattern we've already gone over, so I won't go into that again. Next, we have a G sus2 star block with another modified strumming pattern of number 1 that we went over previously. You start with an up strum on your G sus2 star prime chord, and then a down strum on the G sus2 star chord. So it just sounds like this. Next, it's a muted down-up strumming portion, except this time, if you really want to be accurate to how he does it in the live performances, you would actually unmute the last up-down strum. That would sound something like this. And so the whole G sus2 star block would sound something like this. And of course, if you want an easier way, you could just ignore that whole unmuted up-down strum at the end. It's up to you. Next is the D sus2 block, which is the same as the G sus2 star block you just played, except you mute the entirety of the down-up portion. So that would sound like this. Next is the D sus2 A block, and that has an up-down for the D sus2 prime. And then a muted down, up, down, up, down, up for the D sus2. And then a down, down, up, unmuted for the A chord, followed by a down, up, down, muted. So the entirety of this block would sound like this. So the entirety of the first half of verse 1 would sound like this. Moving on now to the second half of verse 1. So the only part here that's something we haven't gone over before is the D sus2, A sus4 block. So for that, you start with an up-down strum on the D sus2 prime chord, followed by an up strum on the D sus2, followed by 3 down ups on the D sus2. So that whole D portion would sound like this. And then finally a down, down, up, down, up, down, up for your A sus4. So that whole block would sound like this. So the entirety of the second half of verse 1 would sound like this. Moving on now to the first half of pre-chorus 1, and things change up a little bit here. And just a note, whether you want to play the song like the live version or like an easier version, pre-chorus 1 is more or less the same. So you're going to start by playing a normal G sus2 chord using pattern 3, like before. And you're essentially going to play that pattern 4 times in total. From there, you switch to a D chord and play that same pattern about 1.5 times. So you would finish the last 3 strums of the second time through that pattern on a D sus4. So those 2 bars would sound like this for the D. Then you finish playing the D and the A sus4 1 time each with the same pattern. So the entirety of the first half of pre-chorus 1 would sound like this. Moving on now to part 2 of pre-chorus 1, and it starts pretty similarly to the first half. Now you're playing that G5 chord that I mentioned before, or I might have also referred to it as a G sus2 prime. So the G5 portion would just sound like this. Then you switch to the A sus4 and play pattern 3 once. And then you play pattern 4 once. And from there, it's just 5 down strums on that C sharp diminished 7th chord. And you try and mute everything quickly after that very last strum. So that would sound like this. So the entirety of the second half of pre-chorus 1 would sound like this. So moving on now to the first part of chorus 1, and the only thing I think we haven't gone over already is the D sus2 A block. And for even this, we've gone over the strumming pattern, but you're just unmuting the first 3 strums of the A chord portion. So this whole block would sound like this. And again, you could just use pattern 1 or pattern 2 here if you want an easier version of the song, or you could just mute everything for the A chord. Totally up to you. So the entirety of the first part of chorus 1 would sound like this. Second part of chorus 1 now, and yet again, the only thing new here is the D sus2, A sus4 block. and you're just playing pattern 5 once for each chord, which would sound like this. And so the entirety of the second part of chorus 1 would sound like this. Finally, it's part 3 of chorus 1, and it's pretty simple. And this would likely be the same for the live and an easier version. So it's just playing a G sus2 3 times with that pattern number 3. And then a single down strum on the A sus4, and you kind of want to mute right after you do that down strum. So the entirety of part 3 of chorus 1 would sound like this. Next is break 1, and there actually isn't anything new here. So whether you're learning the live or the easier version, just play what you've been playing when you see these chords and strumming show up. So just to play the live version, the break would sound like this. So on to the first half of verse 2 now, and yet again, you've already learned everything here except for the D sus2, A sus4 block. And here it's just yet another variation of pattern 1 if you've been playing the live version. So you start with an up strum for the D sus2 prime, and then a down strum for the D sus2, and then it's just a down, down, up, down for the D sus2. So that first part sounds like this. And then you just strum the exact same thing for your A sus4. So this whole block sounds like this. And so the entirety of the first half of verse 2 sounds like this. Moving on to the second half of verse 2. So the first bit that's different is the G sus2 star block. However, if you want to play it easier, you can just play it how you've been playing this whole time. But the live version starts fairly normal, but during the down up portion, you're actually unmuting about 60% or so of the way through. So that G sus2 star block would sound like this. The only other part that's different is the D sus2 A sus4 block. It's hard to tell in the live performances, but it looks like it starts with a quick up down going from the D sus2 prime to the D sus2. But it could very just well be a down strum on the D sus2, or honestly it's probably easier to just do a down strum for a D sus2 prime, because then you go into a down strum on your A sus4 followed by muted up down strums. So probably the easiest way to play it is the D sus2 prime down strum into an A sus4 down strum followed by muted strumming. So the entirety of the second half of verse 2 would sound like this. On to the first half of pre-chorus 2. You're starting with a G sus2 star chord and playing that pattern 6 strumming pattern 2 times. Next you play that pattern 6 once for the D sus2, but you're unmuted the whole time. And then you play pattern 5 once for the D sus2 and once for the A sus4. So the entirety of the first half of pre-chorus 2 would sound like this. to the second half of pre-chorus 2. You're playing that pattern 6 twice for the G sus2 star, except the second time you're not muting it. Next you would play that pattern 6 once for your A sus2 unmuted, followed by 5 down strums on your C sharp diminished 7th, and then you would quickly mute that chord at the very end. So the entirety of the second half of pre-chorus 2 would sound like this. On to the first half of chorus 2. The only new things here is the D sus2 A block. You're just playing pattern 3 once for each chord, except you're muting after that first down strum. So the D sus2 would sound like this. And then you do the same thing for the A. So the entirety of part 1 of chorus 2 would sound like this. Part 2 of chorus 2 is more or less the same as part 1, but you're playing an A sus4 chord at the very end instead of an A, and that D sus2 A sus4 block has no palm muting. So the entirety of the second part of chorus 2 would sound like this. On to part 3 of chorus 2. You're starting with strumming pattern number 6 for a normal G sus2, but the strumming is unmuted. Then pattern 5, one time for the G sus2. And then it's just an A sus4 where you do one down strum followed by a couple up strums, about 3. So the entirety of part 3 of chorus 2 would sound like this. Next is the bridge. And so the first bit of this, you're using pattern number 7. Starting on a normal G sus2 chord, you strum down, 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 up, and then switch to the G sus2 star for the up, down, 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 up. So that whole G portion would sound like this. Then you play that same strumming pattern, all for an A sus4. And then you would play that whole thing one more time. Next, you're using strumming pattern number 8 on a G sus2 and an A sus4 chord. And you'll remember from before, the X's just mean you're kind of tapping on your guitar with your thumb or your fingers or something like that. Now Ed does this in some of the live videos that I've watched, so do it if you want, but also leave it out if you don't. If you do leave it out, you would just ignore the X's and just keep one normal down strum. So first is the G sus2, and that would just kind of sound like this. Then you would go to an A sus4, and that would sound like this. And then you would play those two chords with pattern 8 2 more times, so 3 times in total. After that, it's just a down strum on the G sus2 and a down strum on the A sus4. So the entirety of the bridge would sound like this. Alright, so we've made it to the last bit of the song, chorus 3. So here is where Ed actually does some plucking, but if you'd like to not do that, then just normal down strums would be fine. So getting into the plucking, if you're doing that, basically for each chord, you're going to be plucking the string that makes up the bass note of that chord with your thumb. You're going to be plucking the third string with your index finger and the second string with your middle finger all at once. So for the B minor 7, it would sound like this. And so the bass note of the B minor 7 is the 5th string, so that's why my thumb is on the 5th string. And then basically you're going to want to quickly mute all your strings after you pluck them. And so your index and middle fingers stay on the same strings the entire time when you're doing these pluckings. It's just your thumb that's moving a little. And so it starts on the 5th string for the B minor 7, moves to the 6th string for the G sus2 star, then the 4th string for the D sus2, and then finally back to the 5th string for the A. So to play the 4 blocks we have here for the plucking, it would sound like this. And so you'd pluck that progression of chords 2 times. And then finally, you have a down strum, followed by 4 more down strums and an up strum on your G sus2 star chord. And there's just kind of a little pause after that first down strum before getting to the rest. So the entirety of that G sus2 star would sound like this. And finally, it's just a down strum on your A sus4. And you kind of mute it right after you strum it. So the entirety of chorus 3 would sound like this. And so that's the whole song. So what I'll do now is do a full playthrough for you to see how it all comes together. Enjoy. And so that's the entirety of the lesson. If you've made it this far, I can't thank you enough. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and found something useful from it. Don't forget to like this video, comment what you thought down below, subscribe to the channel, turn on all the notifications, everything like that, as I'll have many more tutorials to come in the near future, especially with play coming out soon. Thank you.